Today, Ryan and I have a preview for you for a game called Grendel. This is based on a classic, I think at this point, comic book series that's first published in 1982. Eventually went to Dark Horse, but this is from Off the Page Games. If you're familiar, they did Mind Management,
Core
of Discovery. This one is a completely new and different game. Plays nothing like those. And you can see it here set up. You're going to look at the main board and think, oh, it's an area control game. Well, it's, I'd say, kind of like an area control game. There's a lot of asymmetry that we'll get to in a second, but part of that starts with what you're doing out here on the board, because you see these 3 different regions and broken up into different areas. Each player or each faction is actually going to score in a slightly different way. Similar, but slightly different out on the board here, because each faction has different types of pieces. You want to have different parts and pieces in those regions to score. Grendel might only want fear tokens, where the police wants to sort of overwhelm. So that's where the asymmetry starts, but the asymmetry really kicks in with the player factions.
Yeah, and there are 4 factions that you're going to be choosing from. Now, we have a 2-player game set up here, but even in a 2-player game, you're using some dummy pieces, so all 4 factions will be represented. And for the diehard Grendel fans out there, people that know, this is kind of based on the more original, like
Hunter Rose, right?
Noir, Hunter Rose style of Grendel, where it's a city that you're kind of trying to control it. Each faction has their own, motives here, but Grendel is kind of, if you read the comics, he's kind of a bad guy.
He's an assassin by night.
He's an assassin by night.
He's an author by day.
That's true, author by day,
Published
assassin by night.
author by day. Well, you've also got the mob, the police, and Argent.
Which is like his villain, I guess, from the comics. And each one of those factions is going to come with its own player board, and these boards might look kind of similar, and they do kind of some of the similar things on the board. Like, you are trying to ultimately get pieces on the board, move your pieces around, and eliminate your opponent's pieces. But the way that you're doing that, you can almost think of it like 4 different mini games that you're playing, and you're playing them in a very different way at the same time.
Yeah, mechanically, the factions play completely different. For example, the mob here is a dice placement game. On my turn, I'm going to be rolling dice and then placing those dice to take my actions. Whereas Grendel has a bag building mechanic. Ryan's going to be pulling chits out of his bag. He pulls 3 of those and places them on up to 3 different tracks, activating his powers. Now, on top of that, the powers that we're activating, some of them are similar. Some of them are the same, but some of those powers are even different, because like we said, what you're doing out here on the board is also different. For example, Grendel has 1 captain figure, but the only other thing that's going to be on the board is fear, because he's a vigilante. He's going to be spreading fear. Some of his powers allow him to move that around. Some of his powers allow him to move Grendel, and in some cases, you can actually move great distances with Grendel if you've built sort of a network of that fear.
Yeah, it's an interesting mechanic here with this kind of bag building, because as you're kind of filling up these different tracks, you're going to get to a point where you can even upgrade these to some better versions of them. You're going to be doing some matching where if you do play these in the right way, you get some like kicker abilities that allow you to manipulate your bag. So it does feel fully like a bag building game. And then Grendel, like we said, everyone scores differently. Grendel's all about these fear tokens. His only goal is to get these fear tokens out. So I will say now that there's an aspect, a complete aspect of this game where it's not necessarily just about how you're scoring. It's about stopping other players from scoring as well. So each player aid tells you how you score points, but it also tells you how every other faction scores points, because if you're at a point where you're feeling pretty good about your setup, maybe you want to like mess up other players. And Grendel, with that lure ability that we said is unique to him, can really actually mess up some other players' scoring opportunities and kind of subvert the way that other players are playing the game, which is interesting as well.
Yeah, for instance, the mob, like I said, I have different powers. As I'm placing these dice, I'm doing different things out here, but I'm not spreading fear. I'm really just putting more grunts and captains out on the board, because the big difference between the ways we score is once scoring happens, which we'll get to in a second, I'm going to score points when I have 2 different pieces in a region. So for instance, I have 3 here, 2 different ones. I would score right here. Grendel is scoring just as long as he has a fear token there. So where Ryan and other players at the table might say, oh, I'm going to take out this captain. Now I'm not scoring here. If they want to stop Grendel, you have to do something about his fear token. And fear tokens, a lot of the factions have influence tokens. The fear is effectively Grendel's influence token, but it's all Grendel has to work with. All of those tokens can be flipped and sort of shielded, which is going to take a couple actions to sort of like degrade them and get them off the board. But that's what you're going to be trying to do. And then the other factions entirely work very differently.
Yeah.
The police uses a rondel mechanic. You've got this rondel here, and you have these two little police cars, and you place them on the rondel, moving them both on your turn, effectively taking the actions in the little pie piece that you're next to. But if you're also next to each other, you also get to take another little sort of kind of like your kicker actions with the police. But again, the police are trying to get an overwhelming amount of figures out on the board because they're only going to score if in a region they have more pieces than any other player.
That feels more like a traditional area control with the police.
Yeah, that feels like an area majority. You're looking and whoever scores there. But it's interesting because you could score there with the police, but Grendel could also score there.
That's true, because
Grendel has one fear. He doesn't care what the police is doing. As long as he's creating fear, he's going to score points there too. So it brings in an interesting dynamic of how you're trying to score. Do you want to talk about Argent too before we go on to Mayhem?
Yeah, Argent actually scores in a similar way. He has his own tokens here. These are called ambush tokens that go out on the board, but he gets those tokens out in a completely different way like we've been talking about. His is like a push your luck element. And this guy, he's Argent the Wolf. I guess this is like his natural enemy.
A bit like Entropy.
He's got a deck of cards, and you're flipping these cards, and each card has an action, but it also has a number of skulls. If you hit 4 skulls, you bust, and you lose out on doing your bonus ability. If you stop early when you've got like 2 or 3 skulls, then you get your bonus ability. But the key is that some of the cards don't have any skulls at all. So if you're sitting at 3 skulls, you're like, I could flip this over. I think we calculated that if he, in a perfect turn, he could get like 6 actions. But the chances of that happening are very slim because more likely you're going to hit the 4 skulls. And again, he can kind of upgrade some of those as well. So I think it's just interesting. You'll see how like when you're playing the game, you're like looking at other players and going like, oh, you've got cards, you've got dice, I've got a bag. Like it's a very different experience. But what you're trying to do in the game, what you're actually like actively doing on the board is kind of the same for everybody. And a big part of that not only is just scoring your particular objective, but it's also getting these aggression tokens into these little towers, which I think this is something that really sets this game apart.
Yeah, this is the other big sort of hook of this game are these towers. There's one for Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, which represent each of the 3 main areas on the board. One of the main actions in the game, and an action that you're going to be triggering somewhat frequently, sometimes it's a kicker action in the case of Grendel, you're going to be able to take one of your aggression tokens. And these aggression tokens, everyone has a 3, several 2s, and 4-1 aggression tokens. These are all these little plastic tokens, and they're different weights. Ironically, the 1s are heavier than the 3s, but the 3s are going to give the player a little bit more ability maneuver when Mayhem strikes. When you put an aggression token in, you're just going to simply drop it in the box. If nothing happens, that's fine. But now, when Brooklyn eventually scores, which is where I just put it, I'm going to have 1 aggression. Now, if I'd put in a 3, I could have potentially 4 aggression now. And see, it still hasn't dropped. You don't know when it's going to drop. Let's see if Ryan can make it drop. Oh, it looks like it's close.
Brooklyn has a lot of tokens. There it goes.
So you can see how many tokens can go in there. When that happens on a player's turn, they're going to finish their turn. And depending on the game state, other players might be able to finish 1 more turn if it drops really early. But then all that aggression is going to be divvied out to all the players. You're going to get all of your aggression back. Like I said, I'm going to get my 4 aggression.
I put a lot in there, which
I'm going to get. He wouldn't normally.
I wouldn't normally.
We were trying to trigger it. But you're going to get aggression up to a max of 10. And then it's going to start a mayhem phase, which is effectively in a game like this, if to put it in terms you might understand, it's the phase that you're going to score that region. So we're now going to score Brooklyn, but first we go through this series of turns called the mayhem phase, where we're going to be able to manipulate further things that are on the board. This is going to allow you to do things like on your turn, spend aggression, you can spend 1 to punch. When you punch, if you're in a region, you can basically punch another token, like one of the grunts, and get rid of them. So like for instance, if the police were playing and they wanted to spend an aggression to punch this guy, take him out, now I'm not going to score any points here if I'm down to 1 piece, no points for the mob.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. You can spend 2 to degrade a token. So for instance, if my influence is there, someone can spend 2 to degrade that. If you degrade one that's like this, it comes off the board. So you can see during the mayhem phase, if you have a lot of aggression, you're going to be able to, during that phase, really change the board state. And once you're out of aggression, you will score at the end of your turn during that mayhem phase. So if you have very little aggression, and you are the one who triggered it, you might spend, if you had just 3 in there, you could spend all 3 because you have to spend 3 on your turn during the mayhem phase, which is an interesting mechanic. You can't just spend 1 and be done. You have to spend 3 at a time if you have it. But if you spent your 3 because all you had was 3 in there, you're done for the mayhem phase. But you also get to score. So this brings in some interesting strategies because you might be looking at the board state and going, "Ooh, if we scored this right now, that would be great." So on your next turn, you might go, Brooklyn feels like it has a lot in there already. I'm going to add just 1 more. It doesn't give me a lot of aggression, but it is the heaviest, so it might trigger it. If it does, and you come out with just a little aggression, you'll be able to score the board state effectively where it stands right now and score as many points. Now, the downside is if the other players have a lot of aggression in there, they can spend the rest of the mayhem phase then adjusting the board and scoring as many points as they can too.
Well, a whole part of the game, everything leading up to this mayhem phase is to kind of set up for this mayhem phase. So everything you're doing with these different mechanics is all in hopes of scoring points. This is also where these cards come into play too, which we should mention.
Oh yeah.
The mayhem phase is a little more symmetric in that everybody's kind of spending their aggression to do the same things, but these decks of cards are very different. So you're able to kind of manipulate this board in very different ways. And these cards are multifunctional. For one, you play them. They cost a number of aggression and you'll play them during that aggression phase. But also at the very start, if you don't feel like you have enough aggression, like Brooklyn triggers a little early and you've only got 1 or 2 in there, you can actually discard these cards to gain more aggression to spend. Like David said, there's a max of 10. I don't know how often you're going to be getting to 10. Maybe if one of them triggers way late, maybe you actually might have 10 in there. But the best way to do that is to gather a bunch of cards during your action phases, then turn them in for aggression. You'll have more aggression to make moves on the board. But again, you have to weigh that against what David said was exactly right. You want to get to 0 and score when you have the best chance of scoring.
Yeah, before anyone messes with you.
If you have 10 aggression, you're going through multiple phases of this mayhem section of the game before you score, and people could really mess with your board. So I don't know, it's kind of a game about weighing those. And the other point that's worth mentioning is once this scores, that's done, but at the end of the game, it will score again. So you're never really totally get to say, okay, well that Brooklyn's done. Now I can just ignore Brooklyn for the rest of the game. It will score again.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the things that you're doing during Mayhem and during the game too, each faction's going to have an ability that, for instance, when this faction punches a grunt and takes it off the board, that faction that does that usually gets an instant ability, they're able to do something. And even that is asymmetric. For instance, the mob gets to do it, they get to interact with their influence tokens, whereas Grendel gets to do it, and you get to put a fear token in that space.
That makes sense.
Everything that you're doing in the game is sort of in constant motion. And like Ryan said, these cards make it so you can do very unique things that people might not be expecting, because while you can kind of generally do the same things, these cards will let you go, okay, so for instance, someone takes this out and I'm like, well, I'm not scoring this now. So I'm going to play this that allows me to move this here really quick and do some other things to sort of salvage some points, if you will. And
part of the game.
It's a big part of the game. And like Ryan was about to say, the Mayhem is going to resolve for one, and then one of the other ones later in the game is going to trigger. We'll resolve that. And then when the third one triggers, you resolve that too. But after that, like Ryan said, you resolve the other 2 again, which is interesting because at the end of the game, you will have resolved 2 of these sections twice and 1 of them once. And it should be noted, those 2 sections that resolve the second time, you're not getting more aggression out of them. You're simply scoring those areas again. So if there's one area left and you're like, well, I don't really have much presence there anymore, you might be taking all of your turns to basically just cushion yourself as much as possible in the other 2 areas so that when they do score again, you're in a good position and you've kind of sacrificed that other area.
Yeah, and I think what David just said about the game kind of being in a constant motion, a constant flow is very true. Maybe not as much in a 2-player game, but very much so in a 4-player game, because we're using these dummy factions, and these are kind of obstacles in a 2-player game that we have to overcome. We have to, get rid of them or whatever. But in a 4-player game, they're moving around, they're taking actions, they're adding more pieces to the board as you score. And also in a 4-player game, there's a lot more aggression going into these towers. And so like there becomes a race. Like maybe you want, like if you're really good in queens, you want queens to score twice. So you want queens to score at least once during the game. You don't want it to be the last one to score. But if everybody sees you dumping aggression in there, maybe they don't. Because they don't want queens to score because you're going to get a lot of points. I think, I don't want to call it mind games because it's really not, because everything is on the table. But there's definitely this element in a 4-player game of watching what everyone else is doing and trying to see the areas that they're rushing to score so that maybe you can try to like piggyback onto them and score there as well.
Oh, for sure. I could see games where if you're not paying attention to that, something triggers and you're like, okay. And then the next turn, another one triggers and a player at the table is like, oh, I wasn't even paying attention. I didn't know that someone had put, and someone goes, oh yeah, I've been putting all my stuff in there. So the game can really kind of be dynamic and a little unpredictable in that case. So it brings definitely a few different twists. The asymmetry and the way those tower works, I think, are probably the two big twists and stars of the show.
I've seen asymmetry. I've never seen a timer mechanism like these towers. I don't know if you have, where you're adding things and like that. It's got that feeling of like, is this the one that's going to drop it? Like, is it scoring now?
It's like you're playing Don't Break the Ice or Kerplunk in terms of like the tension of like, is this going to drop it? Because they can be unpredictable, and it should be noted too, these little boards that are in the back that basically serve as the counterweights for different player counts. There are different boards. So you'll have a bigger board in a 3-player and a yet bigger one yet for 4-player games, so that there's more influence and aggression that can be put in there. But still, it can be unpredictable in terms of maybe even the way it's dropped in there, because it's basically just pushing a seesaw with that counterbalance of the billboard.
Well, yeah, and you're going to have very different games. You're going to have games where every player at the table is kind of evenly spreading, but maybe you have a game where everyone's just dropping in Manhattan, and Manhattan might score after like 1 or 2 turns, and you're like, well, I was not ready for that. And I think between that pacing of the game changing, the way that these different areas score changing, and the fact that jumping to a different faction makes it feel like you're playing a different game, I think is going to lead to a lot of like replayability and a lot of different like dynamic situations that occur on the board.
Yeah, I would imagine that a lot of people will play this once and they'll be like enjoying their faction. Like I think all of the factions have different ways to enjoy them. Now, depending on what kind of player you are, you might like some things better than others. If you don't like luck, you might not like the push your luck thing. You might like dice placement. You might like bag building, that sort of thing. It should be noted that there is a 5th faction too that's going to be available in the campaign. I think they're the news, the press, basically.
Interesting. I haven't seen that one.
That uses polyominoes that you're placing on your board to take your action. So, I mean, I don't know if there's going to be any more available, but it's really interesting design space for the designers to play in terms of like coming up with a new faction. How does this one gonna work? That sort of thing.
Yeah, and the fact that they were able to layer these different mechanics on top of each other and still have a very tense game where everyone's trying to do such different things, and the way that you interact with each other, it's a really good design, I'll say. Really solid idea.
So that is Grendel from Off the Page Games. If you have any questions at all about it, please make them in the comments below or check out their campaign page. Until next time though, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.